Hey guys, welcome back. In my last video, I was messing around with this guy, the XT2 Extortion pedal from Boss in the mid-90s. And one of the things I really liked about it was this punch control. And if you saw that video, you'll know that I realized that the punch control is actually a mid-boost before the distortion section, or before the clipping section, I guess you'd say. But it's not just any mid-boost, it's not just a full mid-boost, it's actually a narrow band boost right on 600 Hertz. The pedal also has a narrow band boost that's kind of fixed at 3 kilohertz. And it made me wonder what other bands, other narrow bands at different frequencies would sound like if they were before a distortion. So with that in mind, this week I picked up this weird looking pedal. This is an Arion EQ 1. I bought this for like 30 bucks. These were made in Japan originally, and then they shifted to Sri Lanka, I think in the 90s. In Japan, they were actually sold under a brand Sakura. They were always meant to be sort of like a cheap and cheerful option to Boss pedals. They've got a plastic housing. I guess they were kind of the Behringer or Danelectro pedal of their day. I've read a lot online that these are simply clones, or this range were simply clones of Boss pedals. Well, I have had a few across the bench over the last few years, and that's not the case. They're very similar. They're kind of, well, in my experience, they're kind of workalikes or copies, but not really clones of their Boss equivalents. Having said that, this pedal's 7 EQ bands are labelled exactly the same as a Boss GE7. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a schematic on it. So I printed out the GE7 schematic as a bit of a reference. I haven't even opened it up yet, so we'll see what happens. On the bench, I've got a very simple distortion circuit, breadboarded. So I'm going to plug this in and see how it sounds. So up here, we've got a voltage divider for our reference voltage, or virtual earth. We've got a single op amp. This is an 071. And these two resistors set the gain to about 20 dB. Been messing around with the gain a little bit, and it seems like for these diodes and my pickups, 20 dB is about right. If I set my selector onto the bridge pickup, which is pretty hot in this guitar, it's kind of gritty without being too over the top. If I set to single coil mode, kind of just breaking up. So yeah, I think 20 dB is about right. Been messing around with a few other diodes as well. These are Germanium Diodes. You can also use the classic 41, where are they? 4148s. They're the classic diodes. They're in lots of pedals, those ones. Also tried a few LEDs as well. That's what the XT2 had. You need to drive a bit more gain with these because they've got a bigger forward voltage. But anyway, the output of the diodes just goes through an attenuator, and that's another coupling cap and into my amp. The input impedance is set pretty low, it's only 47k, but that's okay in this situation because the pedal has a buffered bypass, so even with the pedal in bypass, the guitar's not sort of suffering. So if I turn the pedal on, again, there's no real difference. But I guess now we can have a listen to some of these different band boosts. If I boost 800, you get that really chewy kind of mid-range. It's really cool, actually. 400. You get those nice sort of overtones. 200 to me gives you something of that quad box kind of low boom. 1.6, you want to avoid that, it sounds awful. It's really nasty, that one. So 3.2, this is roughly where the treble boost up front of the XT2 is. Oh, drop my pick. Bit more gain. So that gives it that sort of scratchy sound. 6.4 you can barely hear. That might have something to do with this pickup. If I go to a brighter setting, the 6.4 kind of gives you a cleaner pick attack, I guess. Yeah, it's a pretty fun sort of pedal. It's very very fiddly. The level control, of course, is now our distortion control or gain, and it's quite touchy, I guess you'd say. Then you can have fun just kind of shaping what's going on before the distortion. I guess it's just like, essentially what I'm doing is stacking two pedals. Distortion followed by, EQ followed by distortion. Wonder if I can get a tube screamer kind of vibe going. They've got a roll off. They've got quite a roll off up front before the clipping, from about 700 Hertz, I think, from memory. So let me try that. Try sort of a subtle boost. Yeah, that's pretty cool. Anyway, yeah, I think it's a really cool idea, and I've decided I'm going to try and build this little distortion circuit onto a little circuit board and see if I can actually install it in the pedal permanently, so I have basically a stack, like two pedals in one. Really versatile distortion pedal. So straight up I can tell just at a glance that this isn't a clone of a GE7. This chip's a 4000 series CMOS chip. I assume it's a flip-flop. So I guess this is doing the bypass switching and activating the LED, which of course is normally taken up in a Boss pedal with this famous little discrete 2-transistor circuit that they seem to use in all of their old classic pedals. So that's one difference. The other thing I've noticed too is that it's kind of hard to show, but because of this all these faders on this standoff, but in total I can see 4 dual op amps. So the pedal has 8 op amps, whereas of course the GE7 has 9 in total. So I don't know what that really means. Perhaps they just haven't bothered with this pre-emphasis circuit here and have just gone straight in with a simpler and more standard kind of EQ design. I'm not really sure. But if I'm going to fit a little circuit into this pedal, I'm going to have to make sure I've got enough room. And I reckon just in here I can actually fit, there's actually quite a bit of room in there, and I reckon I can make this circuit onto a little piece of stripboard that'll fit there. Finding a place for the volume pot though is going to be tricky, but I reckon I can fit it in just down the front here and still be able to slide the circuit board in like that. I will have to find some things on the circuit though. The first will be the equivalent of this cap here. This is a coupling cap between the output of the EQ and the bypass switch or the FET switch. If I rip that cap out, then I'll have basically a send and returned patch point for my little distortion. So I'm going to try and find that cap. The other thing I will have to find obviously is a positive voltage and an earth, but also this guy here, which is our virtual earth or bias voltage. So I'm going to have a scout around for those, and we'll see what we get. Okay, finding this coupling cap actually turned out to be easier than I thought, and that's because Well, 3 of these dual op amps are all the same. They are A6458Ss. I don't know if you can see in there. I looked up the number. It's a audio-specific op amp, dual op amp made by Sanyo. So 3 of those are the same, and then this guy here is a 4558, which is a really common op amp in pedals. Famously, that's the op amp that's in the tube screamer. So I'm guessing if they've used 6 op amps that are all the same, I'm guessing they've used them for these 6 gyrators. It makes sense to have the same op amp for these. So I'm guessing the 4558 covers these 2 op amps here. So what that means is that I just have to find which of these 2 op amp outputs goes to our output coupling cap. I looked up the pin out for the 4558 single inline, and it's actually the same as whatever's in the GE7. So I'm just looking for pin 1 and pin 7. So I traced them through, and pin 1 did something else. Pin 7 actually goes under these jacks and down here, and that is our coupling cap right there. In fact, I'm going to mark it. So that's where I can basically send the signal off to my little distortion circuit and back again, and then really I just have to power the distortion circuit with a positive 9 volt, which you can trace back to the DC jack. That's pretty easy. And an earth, well, that's all over the board. It's easy enough just to see where that comes from, the input and output jacks. So I've just put together this little schematic. This is essentially what was on my breadboard. This cap here creates a treble roll-off at 10 kilohertz or thereabouts, and these 2 1 mic caps create a bass roll-off at, I can't remember, I think it was 30 hertz or thereabouts. With a high gain circuit, you really only want to be boosting, you know, the guitar range. For the diodes, as I mentioned, I've gone with a couple of germanium diodes. You can use 4148s, really common silicon diodes for distortion. You can also use a couple of LEDs in here. If you use LEDs, they'll have a higher forward voltage, which means they need a little more boost if you want a really crunchy sound, in which case you increase this resistor to give the op amp more gain. I've also created this little tiny strip board. I think it's only about 18 millimeters by, I think it was like 25 or 30 millimeters. It'll fit in here, I think, just fine. If you're limited in height, you could lay these 2 resistors over. They're standing up in this design, and you could probably skip the IC socket and solder the IC straight to the board, in which case the whole thing will only be probably 7 or 8 millimeters in height. So it's on to putting my little distortion circuit together. With stripboard, it's a good idea to give the tracks a little rub with some steel wool or Scotch-Brite or something, just to brighten them up, give you better solder joints. For stripboard, this is my favourite little cutter. It has a small ball-shaped carbide end. You can drag it across multiple tracks, or you can just kind of touch it to a hole to neatly cut a single track. If you're just resting a circuit board on your bench, you have to kind of start with all the low profile parts first and then work your way up to the taller parts like electrolytic capacitors. With blue tack, of course, you don't really have to worry about that. You can just kind of work your way from one side of the board to the other because it just sort of smooches into place and holds the board really well. These germanium diodes have obviously been sitting around for a while, and the tinning on the legs has started to break down, so I gave them a quick rub with some steel wool. You could use Scotch-Brite for this as well, just to ensure a good, reliable pair of solder joints. For jumpers like this, I usually use a section of vacant board just to size that second bend. To save a bit of space with this layout, I've designed it with the jumper running under the IC. And there's the 1 mic output coupling cap. And finally, you just want to make sure that all the solder has flowed properly, the joints are nice and shiny, and that there's no shorts. Using a magnifier is a good idea here. There's really only one place I can add that output volume pot, and its location has to be quite specific, so I'm measuring all of this very carefully. So I'll start with a pilot hole, then drill it about 1 millimeter undersize. That way I can finish it with a rat's tail file, just to make sure I get the pot in exactly the right position. Between those two circuit boards, there's really no wiggle room with this one. Quick test fit. I will have to feed the pot wires through those two circuit boards, which will make final fitment a little bit tricky, but you'll see that later on. Unfortunately, the plastic here is too thick to have a shake-proof washer on one side and still have enough threads poking through to get a nut on, so I have to use that little anti-rotation lug on the pots. So I'm trying to just sort of scratch or scrape a little channel for that to sit in. Using the tip of a Stanley blade wasn't really working that well, so I tried using my 1/8 chisel, and it was kind of awkward, but it actually did work, and it worked really well. In hindsight, I probably could have switched to an old tip on my soldering iron and just kind of carefully melted a little divot in there, but it worked in the end, and the pot's not going to rotate. You can pick up this computer ribbon cable for next to nothing in bargain bins, or at computer shops they'll often just give it away. It's why most of my projects have all their earth wires in grey. For this pot I'm just using a 3-way length of it, and I'm marking one edge with a Sharpie. These pots are obviously not designed for point-to-point wiring. It is a little bit fiddly, but it's not really that hard, and you can get a good reliable solder joint. So the project has 5 flying leads. You've got 9 volt, you've got an earth wire, grey as usual, a virtual earth, and then input and output wires. Or I guess you could think of them as send and return from that place where I removed the coupling cap. I was thinking about rehousing this into an aluminium enclosure, but the more I play around with this idea, I think it's so endlessly tweakable that it's a project that's much more at home, I think, in recording studios. So I think I'll just leave it in the plastic box. It is 30 years old and it's still in pretty good shape, but I decided to go ahead and shield the inside of the box. It does have a high gain circuit in it now, after all. There's no need to coat every single internal surface with tape or shielding paint. In fact, with a complex shape like this, you'd end up with so many tiny pieces all sort of stitched together, and I'd be a bit nervous about, over time, perhaps one of those pieces coming loose or peeling away and creating a short. It's probably a bit over the top, but I do like to stitch the pieces together with some tiny soldering tacks. You need to crank your iron right up for this, just so you can get on and off very quickly. You don't want to melt the plastic. That large piece of copper is a huge heat sink and will drag the heat out of the iron tip very quickly. Even if the tape has conductive adhesive, I've found using this stuff in guitars that sometimes that adhesive seems to break down somehow, and overlapping parts won't always have good continuity after 6 months or a year. Of course, all of this lovely copper tape has to be connected to earth, so I'm just adding a wire here. I'll solder up to the board later on. By the looks of it, the pedal's seen plenty of use over the last 30 years, but the enclosure was in pretty good shape. There were a few hairline cracks around this hinge for the pedal lever, so I got some Loctite 480 in there. And I also shaped this thin piece of aluminium and glued it onto the back of that sort of flange there behind the battery enclosure. And that's because that pedal lever was sort of sitting up on a funny angle, and that just sort of limits its upward travel. Here I noticed that this electrolytic was starting to break down. It's got this green discoloration on top. So this is the cap that runs between the virtual earth and earth. That's or the bias voltage. It's designed to stabilize that bias voltage. Famously, actually, in the classic Boss pedals, this is a cap that is problematic. They, for whatever reason, only put a 6.3 volt cap in that location, and those pedals are prone to over voltage from people using the wrong power supplies and stuff. So in this pedal, it's actually a 16 volt cap, but it's clearly seen better days, so I pulled it out and replaced it. I also replaced the main power supply cap, and while I was at it, I removed that coupling cap that I'll have to remove to patch in my little distortion circuit. The main 9-volt decoupling cap here was in this really awkward position on its side with its legs bent underneath the fader standoff board. Blu-Tack does a great job of holding difficult components like this in the right position so you can get a good soldering joint. So there's the new bias voltage cap. It's a little bit larger than the original, but it fits okay. There's plenty of space. You can see here why I really had to get that hole in the right position. Because it's an old school single-sided circuit board and it's not really that heavily populated, I decided to drill through the 9-volt, the earth and the bias voltage into open space, then create 3 little solder pads by scraping away a small section of that green solder mask. Here I realised that my earth wire from my shielding tape is in a pretty silly spot because it's right where I wanted to double-sided tape my little circuit board. So I ended up desoldering it and then moving it to another solder joint. So now I can solder up the pot wires to the board. The cable tie here is probably not strictly necessary, but it does give the wires some strain relief. After all, this will be stuck in place and then it may take a little bit of jiggling to get the rest of the circuit board back into the housing, considering the location of that pot. And there's the send and return or input and output for the distortion. When you're soldering up to large lands like this, you really need to crank the iron temp, and that's because that large area of copper is quite a heatsink. It'll drag a fair bit of heat out of the iron tip. It's why modern circuit boards have little isolated solder pads with 4 little legs running across to the earth plane or whatever it is. So once it was all wired up, I did a really quick test, and for whatever reason the LED stopped working. I checked everything else from dry solder joints to that CMOS chip and all the voltages, and yeah, it was just a dead LED. It's pretty rare, but it does happen. The only 3mm LEDs I had on hand were these little clear ones, and it seems a little bright for the pedal, to be honest, so I might go in and increase the current limiting resistor. That's just a light coat of circuit board lacquer. I like to give copper shielding tape a light coat of the same stuff. Over time it will tarnish and eventually go quite brown actually. And I like to think that sealing up the edges of all of those pieces of tape will give its adhesive a longer life. So I'll heat shrink my little circuit board. That way if it ever did come loose from that double-sided tape, it's not going to cause a short or anything. Can be a bit of a wrestle getting the new parts in their exact place and making sure the wires are out of the way when you're putting everything back together. But you do have to be careful. You don't want to pinch any wires or force anything. And there's the wire from the shielding. That little spring connects the steel base plate to earth. Well, what started out as a bit of an experiment has worked out really well. I have to say, I'm really happy with this pedal. I don't think it's ever going to be a go-to pedal on your pedal board for a particular sound. It's just too flexible and tweakable for that. In fact, I think on a gig, it'd probably drive you crazy because of that. But in the studio, Well, I think that's where it comes into its own. I've just been recording some parts for the little outro jam, which you guys will hear in a sec. And not only can you tweak it up for different instruments, in fact, I got a really cool bass sound out of this by scooping out the mids and cranking the 100 hertz. You can also tweak it for different pickups and pickup settings within the one guitar. Yeah, it's really cool. Obviously, when you think of EQ pedals, you think of the classic Boss GE7. Unfortunately, I don't have one at the moment. I've had them in the past, so I'm not entirely sure that my little circuit board is going to fit inside it for a start. I have been looking at some of my other Boss pedals, and I think I reckon it probably would, to be honest. I think there's going to be enough space. You might have to tweak the layout slightly. But the real issue with the GE7 is that it has a pre-emphasis filter in the input buffer and then a de-emphasis filter right before the output buffer. Putting a distortion circuit between those two filters, I'm not entirely sure how that would affect the sound. I don't think it'd be great. You're not going to hurt anything by doing it, so give it a go. Realistically, you would disable those two filters. It's super easy to do. It's just like removing a couple of resistors. I will put a PDF on my website over the next couple of days with this info in it and a little bit about the GE7 as well if you want to try it with that pedal. But for now, I'm going to say thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, give us a thumbs up. And do consider subscribing to the channel. I do really appreciate that. So I will see you in the next one.